We knew very little about each other when we were in love in Paris. If we leave it that way, maybe we'll remember those days, not Casablanca.
In the smoke-filled Rick's Café Américain, refugees whisper about exit visas while a piano plays old songs about time going by. This is Casablanca, the 1942 Warner Brothers production that Hollywood remembers as a romantic masterpiece. But beneath that polished surface lies a different story, one of desperation, manipulation, and the darker machinery of studio-era filmmaking. What you're about to discover might change the way you see those flickering shadows on Rick's walls.
I am a little more impressed with you.
The café was assembled from borrowed parts. Rick's Café Américain, that exotic atmospheric nightclub that defined the film, wasn't created specifically for this production. Instead, it was built on a Warner Brothers soundstage from recycled sets that had previously appeared in The Desert Song, with ceiling fans that had spun in dozens of earlier films and beaded curtains pulled from warehouse storage. Art director Carl Jules Weil had only 3 weeks to transform these borrowed materials into something that would appear original, assembling what became cinema's most famous café from warehouse leftovers that were dismantled after production, wrapped and forgotten until decades later when a tourist establishment in Morocco attempted to recreate a place that had only ever existed on a California soundstage. Bergman was traded like contract property. When David O. Selznick loaned Ingrid Bergman to Warner Brothers for Casablanca, she had no choice in the matter, entering the production as contract property rather than willing participant. The studio system structure gave actors virtually no control over their careers, and Bergman arrived on set wanting to make For Whom the Bell Tolls instead. Her preferences rendered irrelevant by the transaction between two studios negotiating her labor like commodity exchange. She later admitted she considered Casablanca a minor assignment, something to endure before moving on to projects she actually cared about. And that dismissiveness shaped her performance in ways the film would absorb and transform into something it was never meant to be. Just a routine assignment. Casablanca moved through Warner Brothers as one of 50 wartime productions that year, treated by cast and crew as another routine assignment rather than future landmark. Bergman described it years later as just another film we made, while Bogart showed up, performed his scenes, and moved on without giving the material particular thought. The writers were exhausted and ready to be finished, and the crew approached their work as they did every day, making movies for a factory system that demanded constant output without offering time for reflection or the luxury of believing any single project mattered more than the next one waiting in the production queue. The writers worked on Benzedrine. The Epstein brothers weren't simply burning midnight oil to deliver those daily script pages that would become some of cinema's most quotable dialogue. Like many writers working under crushing studio deadlines during the war years, they relied on Benzedrine, an amphetamine sold legally as a decongestant at the time, to maintain the pace through 18-hour work sessions. Howard Kutch joined them in this chemically sustained marathon, the three writers essentially working separate shifts to feed pages to a production that couldn't afford to stop or slow down. What audiences experience as effortless wit and natural conversation was produced by exhausted men running on stimulants and studio pressure, knowing that failure to deliver meant unemployment in an industry that valued speed over everything except profit. Curtiz ruled through fear and intimidation. Michael Curtiz ran the production with a demanding, sometimes abrasive authority that created an atmosphere of constant tension on set. The Hungarian director's reputation for tyranny was well earned. He screamed at actors in broken English, threw tantrums when scenes didn't meet his exacting standards, and particularly bullied character actors who lacked the power or status to fight back. His treatment of crew members was even worse, demanding retake after retake while ignoring safety concerns and the mounting fatigue of people working under his command. That relentless visual energy visible in Casablanca came at a human cost that nobody on set forgot, even as the film's elegance made audiences assume the production must have been equally graceful. Bogart's alcoholism shaped production schedules. Humphrey Bogart brought his own fatigue and physical deterioration to the role of Rick Blaine, and studio records document the schedule adjustments made necessary by his drinking. Morning scenes with Bogart were frequently delayed or rescheduled for afternoons, when he would be steadier, and production reports mention multiple instances of him being indisposed or unwell, studio code for drunk or hungover.
Here, drink up. We'll never finish the other three.
That world-weary cynicism and heavy stillness that Rick Blaine projects wasn't entirely performance. Much of it was Bogart's genuine exhaustion and the visible toll of alcoholism showing through in ways the camera captured and the audience interpreted as character depth rather than personal struggle. The chemistry was manufactured from mutual indifference. That smoldering connection between Rick and Ilsa that ignites the screen was manufactured entirely through cinematography, editing, and directorial intervention. Bergman and Bogart barely tolerated each other's presence. She found his constant smoking and drinking repulsive and unprofessional, while he complained about her height and foreignness, forcing Curtiz to position them carefully in every shot using wooden blocks, elevated platforms, and precise camera angles to create an intimacy that didn't naturally exist between them. Arthur Edison's lighting completed the deception, softening Bergman's features while holding Bogart in sharper contrast, balancing the textures so the two would appear visually linked, despite the reality that between takes they retreated to opposite sides of the set without speaking. The studio exploited refugees suffering for profit. Those European refugees weeping during the Marseillaise sequence weren't simply acting or following direction. Most were actual émigrés who had fled Nazi-occupied territories with nothing, desperate for any work, and Warner Brothers knew this and exploited that desperation. The studio paid them barely above minimum wage while profiting substantially from their authentic anguish. And while the film used their genuine suffering to create one of its most powerful and moving scenes, these displaced people earned a fraction of what contract players received. Some hadn't heard their national anthems since escaping persecution. And when they cried on camera, those tears were real, captured by a studio that paid them day rates and later generated substantial box office returns. From emotion, it had essentially commodified. Censors forced the film to weaken its political statement. Hollywood's censorship office wouldn't allow Casablanca to explicitly show Nazis as Nazis in the Café sequences, because the production code prohibited depicting current nations negatively. The German officers had to be genericized, their uniforms modified from authentic Wehrmacht designs, and their anthem changed to Diva Amma Hein instead of party songs. The powerful moment where refugees drown out fascism with La Marseillaise was nearly eliminated entirely until Warner Brothers negotiated a compromise that satisfied the letter of the code while weakening the very statement the scene was meant to make, leaving audiences to experience what was actually a watered-down version of what the filmmakers had originally intended. Henreid was trapped in a role he despised. Paul Henreid, cast as the noble resistance leader Victor Laszlo, considered the role beneath him and accepted it only under threat of suspension from Warner Brothers. He wanted to play Rick, the complex, morally ambiguous center of the story, but instead was given Laszlo, whom he considered a walking symbol with virtually no human dimension worth exploring. He complained repeatedly about the character's lack of depth, while the studio ignored his objections. And that slight stiffness visible in his performance isn't noble restraint or deliberate acting choice, but rather an actor going through motions he resented, playing a part he despised while trapped in a contract he couldn't break. Sam's piano performance actually couldn't play at all. Dooley Wilson, who played Sam, couldn't play a single note on the piano, yet his musical performance became central to multiple scenes and the film's entire emotional architecture. The studio hired him knowing this limitation, installed Elliot Carpenter just off camera to actually perform the music, and had Wilson fake hand movements that rarely matched the notes audiences heard. The deception worked because Curtiz focused the camera on faces rather than hands, anchoring moments in emotional reaction rather than technical mechanics, allowing Wilson's warmth and genuine vocal talent to overcome the fundamental dishonesty at the center of his scenes, while audiences remained unaware they were watching an elaborate mime performance. The letters of transit were complete fabrication.
You know what this is? Something that even you have never seen. Letters of transit, signed by General Veidt.
The entire plot hinges on letters of transit signed by General de Gaulle that supposedly cannot be questioned or rescinded, yet these documents never existed in any actual wartime procedure or bureaucratic system. The writers invented them as a convenient narrative device, a MacGuffin to drive the story forward, and the studio counted on audiences in 1942 not knowing enough about exit visas and travel documents to question their authenticity. The film treats these papers almost like talismans, passed hand to hand and framed prominently, held just long enough for audiences to understand their weight, without recognizing that the most sought-after objects in the film were pure fabrication, as hollow as the promises Rick makes before sending Ilsa away. The love story was written by an uncredited ghost. The romantic elements that most audiences remember and cherish, the Paris flashbacks, the emotional core, the intimate scenes between Rick and Ilsa, weren't written by the credited screenwriters Julius and Philip Epstein or Howard Kutch. Instead, Casey Robinson was brought in by Hal Wallace to write the entire love story, and he never received screen credit for his contribution. The studio system allowed producers to bring in uncredited writers to fix problems without acknowledgement, and Robinson's work was enormous. The heart of Casablanca, the part that elevated it beyond just another war picture, came from a writer whose name doesn't appear anywhere on the film, his contribution erased from the official record, while his words became some of cinema's most quoted dialogue. Nobody knew how the film would end. The production moved forward without a completed script or locked ending, creating chaos that extended throughout filming.
Can I tell you a story, Rick?
You got a wow finish?
I don't know the finish yet.
Ingrid Bergman kept asking Michael Curtiz who her character would end up with, needing to know how to play her scenes opposite Bogart and Henreid. But nobody could tell her because the writers themselves didn't know and were frantically rewriting pages every night. The famous airport scene was finalized barely 48 hours before cameras rolled, forcing Bergman to play Ilsa caught between two men while being genuinely caught herself, not knowing her character's fate. That confusion translated directly into her performance, and what audiences read as complex emotional ambiguity was actually an actress working completely blind, uncertain whether she was playing a woman who would stay or leave, love or sacrifice. The production chaos created misery on set. Bogart retreated to his trailer and sulked between takes when script changes arrived that contradicted what he'd already filmed. Production reports document multiple shutdowns because Bogart was unhappy about the constant rewrites, while Bergman attempted to play scenes without knowing where they would lead. Henreid resented being in the picture at all, and Curtiz and Bogart got into heated arguments over line readings for the final scene. Disagreements severe enough that Hal Wallace had to leave his office and come to the set to mediate, which was extraordinarily rare and indicated how badly the atmosphere had deteriorated. What came across on screen as romantic tension was actually genuine frustration and confusion among people who didn't know what story they were telling and mostly didn't believe it mattered anyway. Steiner was overruled by a haircut. Max Steiner hated As Time Goes By and lobbied studio executives aggressively to let him replace it with an original composition. And initially they agreed, prepared to recall Bergman for reshoots to film new scenes with different music. Then someone realized her hair was already cut short for Whom the Bell Tolls, making reshoots logistically impossible and leaving Steiner furious at being overruled, not by artistic judgment, but by a haircut. He grudgingly wove a song he despised throughout his score, allowing it to surface and recede like memory. And what became the film's most memorable musical element, the emotional foundation that holds the picture together, exists entirely because of a logistical accident and a composer's failed power play. Ilsa was deliberately written as morally questionable. Ilsa isn't simply caught between two men in an impossible romantic situation. She was deliberately written and directed to appear morally ambiguous in ways the film never resolves or fully explains. Did she abandon Rick in Paris already knowing Victor was alive? Did she lie to both men about her feelings and intentions? The script keeps these questions unanswered, and Curtiz directed Bergman to play the uncertainty rather than resolve it, because moral ambiguity made her more interesting than innocence would have. It's wonderful how the makers of the movie put it all out there. Fittingly, while some audiences think of Ilsa as someone who ruined Rick and might yet ruin Victor, never quite absolved by the narrative, there is also a sizable audience that romanticizes her and remembers her as a tragic heroine, overlooking her lies and manipulation. The studio profited from real war casualties. Warner Brothers deliberately rushed Casablanca into production to capitalize on America's entry into the war, and while soldiers were dying in North Africa, the studio was manufacturing romance and heroism specifically for profit, seeing commercial opportunity in genuine tragedy. When Operation Torch launched in November 1942, while the film was still in post-production, the marketing department worked overtime to tie the entertainment product to actual military operations in Casablanca, essentially using real casualties as promotional opportunities. Publicity materials appeared almost immediately linking the fictional Café to genuine combat, and the studio accelerated release schedules to exploit current events for box office returns, proving that even wartime sacrifice could be turned into revenue if the timing was right and the marketing aggressive enough. Veidt died without seeing his work vindicated. Conrad Veidt, who had fled Nazi Germany with his Jewish wife after defiantly writing Jude on a propaganda ministry race questionnaire, approached the role of Major Strasser with seriousness shaped by personal conviction rather than mere professional commitment. He donated substantial portions of his salary to war relief efforts and took Nazi roles specifically to ensure they were portrayed as the villains he knew them to be from first-hand experience.
Everybody's having such a good time.
Yes, much too good a time. The place is to be closed.
But I've no excuse to close it.
Find one.
He died of a heart attack in April 1943, just months after Casablanca's release, only 50 years old, never seeing the film become recognized as a classic or knowing that his defiant act of solidarity with his wife would be remembered as an act of courage, his sacrifice of career, homeland, and ultimately health to stand against fascism ending before he could understand what he'd helped create. The final line was manufactured in isolation.
Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship wasn't written during production or performed during principal photography, but was instead recorded weeks after filming wrapped, with Bogart called back alone to stand in a recording booth and deliver multiple takes of a line Hal Wallace had written in post-production. The film originally ended in silence, with Rick and Renault simply walking into fog without further dialogue. But Wallace felt it needed something more, and wrote the now famous closing himself. Because the line sits over already completed and locked visual material, it feels reflective rather than performative, and what became the perfect ending to one of cinema's most quoted films was added as an afterthought. The Oscar came before most Americans saw the film. Casablanca won the Academy Award for Best Picture of 1943, despite extremely limited release, taking Hollywood's highest honor before most of the country had even had opportunity to see what they were honoring. Warner Brothers had released it in just a handful of select cities on November 26, 1942, solely to qualify for awards consideration, then deliberately held back wider distribution until January 23, 1943. Most Americans hadn't seen it yet when it won on March 2, 1944, which meant the studio could use the Oscar itself as the primary marketing tool, essentially selling the award rather than the film. Audiences went to theaters specifically to see the picture that won Best Picture without knowing what they were actually getting, and the prestige preceded genuine popularity by months, making Casablanca one of the few Best Picture winners that achieved its widest audience after, rather than before, its Oscar triumph. The film inspired one of the 80s biggest hits. 40 years after Casablanca's release, a Florida musician named Bertie Higgins wrote a love song called Key Largo that referenced the film heavily, including the iconic line, "Here's looking at you, kid." His record label initially rejected the song, but Higgins persisted until they reconsidered. Key Largo became a #1 hit in America in 1982, selling millions and introducing a new generation to Casablanca's romance. The irony? Higgins then released a follow-up song, actually titled Casablanca, which flopped completely in the United States, but became one of the biggest hits in Chinese music history, going multi-platinum across Asia and earning Song of the Year in the entire Pacific Rim. The film that nobody thought mattered during production had become so culturally powerful that even songs about it could launch international careers, though sometimes in the most unexpected places. The lights come up, the cafe dissolves, Rick and Ilsa walk into fog that was pumped from machines, toward a plane made of plywood, speaking lines they didn't know would become immortal. Oh, the strange alchemy of it all. Casablanca taught Hollywood that you don't need noble intentions to make noble art. You just need talented people, impossible pressure, and the willingness to keep the cameras rolling even when nobody knows what happens next. The film plays on, and the masterpiece built from broken pieces keeps breaking hearts.
How can you close me up? On what ground?
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here.
You're winning, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. Everybody out at once.